Hello. What will happen when two students from the Magic Academy challenge each other? No one expected this outcome. Gray unleashed an ether magic orb 100 times larger than his opponent's. If the professor hadn't intervened, that student would have been completely obliterated. Looking at Gray, he couldn't understand how the boy possessed such power. No student had ever wielded such terrifying magical energy. But the truth is, Gray is a regressor, and he wasn't always this strong. His story begins like this. It was the final battle between humanity's greatest heroes and their demonic foes. But this time, we're not following some celebrated, overpowered hero. Instead, our protagonist is just another grunt soldier, diligently doing his job as a foot soldier. A stray, sharp laser beam shot straight through his chest. A blow so powerful he didn't even resist and just let it pass through. And just like that, his story ended. In his final moments, he looked around at his dead comrades scattered across the battlefield. As for the so-called greatest heroes, well, they were locked in a fierce clash with humanity's arch-nemesis and the Purifier. Among the heroes were 4 brave warriors, each with their own unique traits and flashy powers. And then there were guys like our boy, the grunts thrown in his sacrificial pawns. Basically, these guys are like NPCs standing in a corner with no dialogue. Their only purpose is to die. He felt pathetic, thinking he had contributed so little to this war. If only he had been born with some kind of talent. But no matter how strong those heroes were, they didn't stand a chance. The Purifier literally cut them down like melons. A single blow was enough to wipe them out. Turns out that monster was just toying with its prey the whole time. The fate of humanity was finally sealed. Or at least, that's what Grayleaf thought, until he remembered that his heart had been torn to shreds. And yet, he wasn't dead. The next thing he knew, he was standing amidst a pile of rubble. Before him was an omnipotent being who offered zero explanation about what was happening. The mysterious figure claimed that Gray's body had been healed. But the crazy part is, he had healed himself, with a power that had been buried deep within him all along. The entity continued, saying that Gray was actually much stronger than the Purifier, the very same bastard who slaughtered all those heroes like pigs. He wasn't sure if Gray could handle that power, so for now, the entity lent our boy a fraction of his own strength, just enough to take down the Purifier. Back in the real world, Gray's sword was immediately enveloped in a mysterious energy gifted by the omnipotent being. Wasting no time, he tested this new energy to see if it was the real deal or just a gimmick. Turns out, this power packed a serious punch, so much so that the Purifier actually complimented Gray on his strength. But it still wasn't enough. When Gray charged in for another attack, bam, he was sliced in half just like the others. Blood gushed from his bisected body while the Purifier, oddly enough, praised him again. He was the first person to push the Purifier to the point where it had to go all out. But the Purifier was in for another surprise. Gray wasn't done yet. That pitch-black energy was fueling him. His lower half, which had vanished just a second ago, had now regenerated, made entirely of dark energy. My man is going full-on Black Clover mode with his greatsword. It was a sight to behold. To think that someone could actually make the Purifier flinch. The enemy had no choice but to erect a honeycomb shield to protect its sorry hide. Gray no longer looked human. He swooped down with his massive blade, and the impact created actual shockwaves in the air. The shield shattered into glittering fragments. Mr. High and Mighty finally took a hit with the full force of the blow. Now that bastard's getting serious, wondering if the thing it was fighting was even human. Hell, it wasn't even sure if Gray was still alive. Meanwhile, our boy was wondering the same thing, but right now, all that mattered was the fight. And yeah, this freak was tough as nails, but our boy was just as determined to settle the score and take this bastard down. He wouldn't stop until this threat was eliminated. He unleashed another frantic slash, and this disgusting freak started bleeding some weird yellow blood in response. The monster unleashed some kind of high-level spell and sprouted angelic wings. It seemed to be messing with time itself, as day turned into night, with the moon shining down like a spotlight from the gods. The scene was pretty impressive, and Gray admitted it, but not impressive enough to shake his confidence. He went full throttle, launching a preemptive strike straight for the Purifier's neck. But surprisingly, the sword didn't pierce through. There was some weird shield around it again. Then it started spouting some nonsense that I couldn't make heads or tails of. Apparently, in this true Twilight dimension, nothing could harm it. Or at least, that's what the bastard claimed. It told Gray to look up at the sky to see just how much trouble he was in. Well, our boy curiously looked up and saw something like a blinding star glowing with insane intensity. Then boom! The thing came crashing down like a damn meteor and wiped Gray from existence. The Purifier stood there in victory, looking down at the crater left behind. But luckily, the mysterious entity from before showed up again, just in time to rewind everything and send our boy back to the past with a single mission: save the world. By the way, that mysterious man's name is Kronos. It seems he and the Purifier have some kind of history, but no one's telling us what. Anyway, back to our boy, who opened his eyes in a peaceful green neighborhood right after regressing. The place was quiet, serene, and truly picturesque. Turns out, he was in his hometown, Renato Village. Not just his hometown, but a past version of it. He had returned nearly 15 years into the past. It seems Kronos kept his word. Gray had been sent back to the past for one last chance to save the world. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his hand. When he looked at his hand, he noticed wounds and bandages wrapped around his wrist. Come to think of it, this was the time in his life when he was basically a punching bag for Belder and his gang. But with this second chance at life, it would be pathetic if he still got bullied. But then again, there was no way he could face them head on. Our boy was much weaker than them. Thinking back, even defeating the Purifier sounded like a pipe dream. Regardless, he had to figure out how to deal with these bullies or he'd have to relive the same misery all over again. Looks like our boy can't catch a break. Or can he? He just happened to run into the very same bastards he dreaded the most. Of course, it was Belder and his lackeys. Since they were bored lately, they had gone out hunting for our boy, eager to continue their good old tradition of bullying as if it were their new religion. They threw a spare sword at his feet, ordering him to pick it up. Our boy stared at the sword, completely clueless. He still didn't get what these guys were up to. After all, it had been 15 years, so his memory was a bit hazy. Meanwhile, Belder assumed Gray was just playing dumb, so he kindly reminded him about their usual sparring matches. Hearing this, Gray quickly tried to shoo these pests away by pointing to his injured hand. He was grateful for the offer, but unfortunately, he couldn't participate since his injury hadn't healed yet. But it seems our boy can't get away from these thugs unless he picks up the sword and fights. They even assured him that these swords were completely blunt, so there was almost no chance of getting hurt. However, Gray couldn't shake the feeling that he could still get injured. No matter how dull the blade, it was still a lump of iron. One wrong hit to a vital spot could book you a one-way ticket to heaven. Well, he had a point. A light tap to a vital area and you'd be doubled over on the ground in excruciating pain. But these guys didn't seem to grasp the logic in Gray's words. Belder got into a ready stance to attack. He hated hearing no from Gray, so he charged at him like a mad bull to start the fight. Gray had been given time to grab his sword, but time was up, and Belder was already rushing him. Our boy found it ridiculous that this guy called it a sparring match while charging in like he was mad at his own mother. That's when he remembered what a former army medic told him about why his swordsmanship never improved. It was because of an injury he got as a kid. Now that he thought about it, this was probably the injury that changed his life forever and forced him to live as a nobody. Belder charged down with his sword, but Gray sidestepped and dodged the attack. Seriously, even Gray himself was shocked that he dodged it. Meanwhile, Belder's face tightened with anger at seeing such impressive agility. He launched another strike, and our boy dodged it again. Then a quick attack aimed at his legs was also easily avoided. That bastard was desperately trying to land a hit on our boy, looking like a bloodthirsty maniac on a mission. He was determined to take down his opponent, but Gray weaved through it all like a ninja on crack. At first, Gray thought Belder was just slow, but then he realized it wasn't that Belder had gotten slower. It was that he himself had gotten faster. My man was dodging every attack like he was running from a debt collector. Even Belder's goons couldn't believe their eyes. Gray was like a completely different person. He might not have his old body, but he still had the memories of every battle he'd ever fought. With all that experience ingrained in his mind, his body was basically moving on instinct. He barely had to try to dodge those blows. Then Gray grabbed a sword to continue this sparring match, which didn't feel much like a sparring match anymore. Belder was drowning in his own ego, frantically trying to crush Gray under his blunt blade. Our boy had had enough. He swung his sword for the first time, and the sudden jolt from his powerful swing sent a painful shock through Belder's hand, which just showed how truly pathetic Belder was, if Gray was being honest. He actually felt like he was the real loser for having to square off against someone so weak. But he also believed Belder didn't deserve an ounce of pity. This was the same scumbag who had bullied Gray, stolen his future, and caused all that suffering, so if you'll excuse him. Gray was going to give Belder a taste of his own medicine. In the next exchange, Gray easily knocked the sword out of Belder's hand, disarming him instantly, while Belder could only feel humiliated. Gray realized this guy was even worse than he thought. He took the opportunity to taunt him, mocking Belder's incompetence with a sword. A single blow sent Belder's sword flying. But hey, being disarmed wasn't that big of a deal. It was Belder himself who insisted these blunt blades were perfectly safe to use in a fight. Gray went ballistic, swinging his sword so fast that it actually cut through Belder's skin, drawing blood. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Belder's knees gave out and he collapsed. Wait a minute, Gray thought he was using a blunt sword, so why did this bastard start bleeding? When he looked at his blade to confirm, he found that it was indeed a blunt sword. Though if it had been a sharp sword, this guy would probably be dead for real. Now, let's not get distracted from the situation at hand. Gray swung his sword with precision, knocking out a few teeth and making Belder's nose bleed like a faucet. Our boy stood tall right over this punk, giving him a chill that would last a lifetime. It's always pretty entertaining to see arrogant scumbags turn into a blubbering mess. It seems like this was enough to teach Belder a lesson in humility for the rest of his life. Oh, looks like I spoke too soon. This bastard still hadn't learned his lesson. He ordered his goons to grab our boy and beat him up until he was black and blue. The goons hesitated to move forward for obvious reasons. They'd just seen their boss get beaten like a pathetic dog, so there was no reason to rush in and share his fate. Although they could probably avoid that, one of them suggested they attack at the same time to overwhelm Gray. The trio quickly moved into action, surrounding our boy from all sides. However, Gray remained as nonchalant as ever. If these guys were so eager to have their death wish granted, then our boy was more than ready. They all rushed him with the intent to finish him right here and now. At first, Gray had a little pity for these strays and had decided to spare them. But it seemed like they wouldn't stop until they'd learned their lesson, so he gave these sewer rats what they truly deserved. Before long, their faces were swollen up like a baboon's ass after an unforgiving facial massage. Once again, Gray found it laughable that these walking sad face emojis were once his worst nightmare. He remembered that this group were currently students at Seria's swordsmanship dojo. Belder admitted they were students of that dojo, though they hadn't been going recently, because these soggy biscuits believed they were already strong enough. Oh, pretty low standards for those who are supposedly strong enough. Not that Gray expected much from the dojo itself. He expressed interest in joining the dojo, so he wanted these goons to be his sponsors. Belder refused to comply, as he couldn't. Imagine the consequences once his master found out he'd gotten his ass handed to him so pathetically. Gray knew exactly how to deal with these guys. He simply swung his sword around to intimidate these idiots, implying the worst could happen if they didn't listen. Funnily enough, this little threat worked wonders. Not only was Belder taught a lesson in humility, but that beating also gave him the speed of a cheetah. He was actually booking it down the road to get to the dojo as fast as possible, even leaving his friends behind. A while later, they entered the town. As they walked, Belder expressed his curiosity about why Gray was interested in joining a dojo. It turns out this dojo has a recommendation slot for the academy. Our boy didn't need to say more, as he was sure Belder was mature enough to understand what his main goal was. One of the other guys wondered why Gray felt the need to join the academy when he was already strong enough. Enough? These idiots had no idea that our boy didn't set his standards that low. He had his own definition of enough. He vividly remembered the day when all of humanity's heroes were slaughtered like pigs in the blink of an eye, and that was supposed to be the strongest lineup in the world. Forget the heroes. Even he couldn't scratch that bastard's skin with all the mysterious power he had. Only God knows how much power it would take to defeat that son of a bitch, though he wasn't completely hopeless at the time. The moment he obtained those badass dark powers, he felt like an omnipotent being who could destroy anything. What held him back was his lack of swordsmanship skills. He had relied on a few tricks he learned from the Sword Saint. If only he had spent more time practicing his swordsmanship, just like the Sword Saint did, he was pretty sure he could have single-handedly turned the tide of the battle. This was probably why Kronos sent him here, to grind his ass off until he was worthy of using that mysterious dark power again. A while later, we meet the master the goons were talking about. The group is getting an earful for picking a fight with a civilian. And what's worse, all they got for challenging that civilian was a humiliating defeat. This intimidating woman is Saria, the master of the swordsmanship dojo. Belder tried to explain that they weren't really trying to bully anyone. It was just a simple sparring match. The poor bastard ended up getting decked for his lie. A blow strong enough to send him to the moon on a one-way ticket. His goons were trembling in terror, hoping they could just survive the day. Nothing to be afraid of, boys. That was just a little lesson she wanted to teach these idiots. If they called beating an unarmed person a sparring match, then what she did also counted as a sparring match. She pointed her sword right at Belder's ugly face and kicked him out of the dojo on the spot. Not just him, but his goons went with him. And just like that, those pathetic minions carried their pathetic, defeated leader and walked away miserably. She immediately turned around and knelt down and apologized to her new recruit on behalf of her former students who had caused him so much trouble. Our boy brushed off the apology and got back to the main point. She heard he wanted a recommendation to the academy. Our boy confirmed it. Since Belder and his second-rate crew had caused him a lot of trouble, she was willing to write him a letter of recommendation. However, before she did that, she wanted him to prove his worth. Both opponents stood facing each other, wooden swords in hand. As the senior, she generously gave him the chance to strike first, and so the exchange of blows began. They moved so fast that all they left behind were after images. From their terrifying attacks, all the while, Saria did her job, which was to assess the guy's abilities. She could tell that his swordsmanship was quite practical for his age. It was as if he had gone through countless battles before. Now it made sense why those idiots got their asses handed to them by a single person. His style was mostly self-taught, but occasionally, his swordplay looked similar to what was taught at the academy, which meant that someone had probably taught him. Although his techniques were still raw, one thing was for sure: he had a lot of talent. His natural talent waiting to be unlocked and brought to its full potential. Basically, she had found a diamond in the rough. Now that her assessment was complete, she decided to end the match with a final blow she was about to unleash. Our boy went on the defensive and easily parried her blow. This dance of death began once again. The young man was literally parrying her every attack as if he were allergic to taking damage, which made the swordswoman start to worry. His lack of hesitation was unnerving her. It seemed none of her attacks could shake his stance. She even started to get annoyed with herself, thinking that she had to go all out in a sparring match. Just for the sake of assessing this young gun's abilities, she was so overwhelmed that she started to feel scared for a moment. He looked like a demonic entity about to unleash something terrible. After easily parrying the final swing from our boy, she realized it was just a random swing. After that frantic swing, Gray started to feel tired and his energy dropped. The swordswoman saw him falter and mistook it for an opening in his defense, so she charged in like a ferocious cat, only to be checkmated on the spot. The tables had completely turned. The broken wooden sword fell to the ground, while Gray stood stunned for a moment. He had rediscovered the path to the dark power he received during his battle against the Purger. The fact that he just used a bit of that power meant he could still access his abilities, even after regressing to the past. But then it happened. A painful side effect engulfed his body in excruciating pain, so much so that he collapsed to his knees, unable to even stand on his own. While Saria panicked at his condition and wanted to help, even after using just a fraction of his power, Gray realized that his current body couldn't handle his full capabilities. Even so, he gathered his resolve to get up again. Despite his trembling body, after telling her he was fine, Gray was lost in his own thoughts, realizing he could barely stand, which highlighted how efficiently he would have to use his abilities. He was also thinking about revealing information about his powers to the swordswoman. Experienced before him, Saria just looked at him, completely confused and puzzled. Meanwhile, our boy assessed the situation with a cool head and concluded that he shouldn't tell anyone what had happened. After all, who would believe his ridiculous story? And it's not like he could control his dark powers at will to prove it. Thinking this, he made up a naive excuse that he had simply overexerted himself, but as for the swordswoman, she didn't buy it for a second. Thinking how ridiculous his excuse sounded, there was no way he could have broken her wooden sword. When they were fighting with blunt weapons from the start, she proved to be a smart one, to the point that she understood Gray was hiding something from her. Virgil's daughter pointed the remains of her sword at our boy, prompting Gray to ask if there was a problem. It was clear from the way he handled his reaction. She understood that he didn't want to talk about anything right now. Instead of questioning him, she respected his decision and asked about his original concern of getting a recommendation letter for the academy. Our boy confirmed this, sharing that he heard she could help him with that. Saria didn't deny it either. She emphasized that with her authority alone, she could get him a recommendation letter to the Royal Swordsmanship Academy, the best educational institution their kingdom had. At the same time, surprisingly, she showed no interest in recommending him to that academy, adding that Gray was not a good fit for it. Her cold words cut him deeper than any blade. Gray started blaming himself. In his heart, doubting his own abilities and admitting that he was too weak, his final attack was the only noteworthy thing he had done in that fight. But wait, Saria wasn't finished speaking. She continued her train of thought, suggesting that instead of going to the Royal Academy, the kid should go to the World Union Academy. What a plot twist. This revelation hit him harder than Truck Kun hitting its isekai victims. Although the Royal Academy is the best in the country, the World Union Academy is the best in the entire world. This academy was considered the pinnacle of swordsmanship. Gray was speechless because this very magic academy was responsible for producing the strongest combat team, including people like Sword Saint Amy. He immediately confronted Saria, asking if he was even qualified to attend such a prestigious academy. Like that, funnily enough, the girls shot down his expectations, pointing out that in his current state, there was no way in hell he'd even pass the first round. The swordswoman knew that even Gray was aware of his shortcomings, especially when it came to his pathetic physical condition now. If it were the Royal Academy, the kid could pull off a miracle with his sword skills alone. But that wasn't the case for the World Union Academy, so our boy was screwed if he didn't train his ass off. Even Saria was astonished. The kid had extraordinary talent in swordsmanship, yet he had the body of a twig. Doubt began to creep in, making Gray genuinely worried about the monstrous opponents he would have to face. At the World Union Academy, it wasn't going to be a walk in the park, and with his current body, it was impossible. Anyway, seeing his dejected look, Saria pointed out that he was giving up too soon even though there were still a whole 9 months until the Academy's entrance exam, once again, due to his lack of confidence in his abilities. Gray thought that even that amount of time wasn't enough for him, despite her efforts to encourage him. Even Saria agreed that it was too short a time, but even so, she was giving him a chance. The swordswoman wanted him to trust her for the next 9 months because during this time, she was going to put him through hell on earth. Yeah, something tells me she's going to hire David Goggins and make this guy run 3 ultramarathons and do 6,000 pull-ups, something like that. Gray admitted that although he didn't want to suffer, he had no other choice, declaring himself ready. He hoped the swordswoman would take care of him. Saria seemed pleased with his determination. At first, you might think it's a good sign that they're starting on a positive note, but the atmosphere immediately turned completely terrifying. As Virgil's daughter officially announced the beginning of his hellish training, Gray's painful trials began. He trained like Goku and honestly, ate like Goku too. She was really putting him through a bulking phase. He also had to face some questionable dishes, but his master showed no mercy and made him go through everything, their sword fights. It continued as usual. The goal was to sharpen his techniques, and then 8 months passed in the blink of an eye. Congratulations to Gray for getting a six-pack after enduring that long training. Even Saria was here admiring his physique. Now that things had come to this, she had nothing left in her arsenal to teach him. He was ready to step out into the real world, but her relaxed attitude confused Gray. Because there was still a whole month until the entrance exam, Virgil's daughter reminded our boy that it would take him a long time to travel to the entrance exam location. That's why he had to leave early. As a final parting gift, Saria gave him a bag of money, ensuring him a smooth journey, covering his expenses for the entire month. What a true master. As for our boy, he still didn't feel right about leaving so early. Her forceful approach made him sad because he thought his master was pushing him away like a burden. Smiling at his answer, she thought he was overcomplicating things, when suddenly, Gray mentioned a rumor about a nearby goblin nest. This caught Saria's attention, and he also pointed out that the village was completely unsafe due to the lack of guards. The swordswoman also confirmed the nest's existence. It had only been discovered recently. At the same time, she smiled at him, believing that nothing bad would happen. If the worst-case scenario did occur, they would just have to rely on help from the capital. Although Gray was very worried, she thought his only concern should be taking the exam without any stray thoughts on his mind. In his head, he was dead certain that his master was lying to reassure him, so he wouldn't have to worry. The capital would never send aid to a small village, and when the village was raided and destroyed by the goblins, that would surely lead to Saria's tragic death. In his past life, he knew she had died fighting all by herself. Regardless, he didn't tell her any of this and just accepted the situation, thanking his master for all her help. Gray was about to leave immediately and was sent off with a smile from Saria. She and her 2 big round assets were cheering for him to pass. A few days later, we see her traversing a dangerous path to get to the lair. Human skeletons were gruesomely hung from the trees as a warning. Saria was trying to track the lair using information she had received from a scout. Spotting a blood trail up ahead, she knew danger was lurking. But before she could do anything, the swordswoman was startled by the familiar voice of her disciple, who was sitting on a tree branch. He asked his beloved master where she was going at this time of night. Surprised by his sudden appearance, she asked what he was doing here when he should be focusing on the academy. After making a perfect landing, he teased her for questioning him, when she was the one who should be answering questions. She had lied to him when she said she would ignore the situation with the lair and let the royal capital handle it. Making an excuse, Saria explained that the capital had refused to come due to their own affairs, which was why she had to take on this quest by herself. She was confident in her swordsmanship, believing that whatever was in that lair, she could defeat, especially after receiving the scout's report. Saria revealed that her opponent would be an elite ogre, and its monster minions, which numbered around 50, not even counting the boss. She knew fighting the monsters would be difficult due to their numbers, but that didn't stop her from going. Incidentally, even Gray admitted that an elite ogre wasn't strong, at least not strong enough to defeat someone of her caliber. However, the thing about ogres is that their unique advantage comes from their intelligence and overwhelming numbers. With so many of them in that lair, Saria would surely die if they managed to surround and overwhelm her. In addition, our boy knew one thing with absolute certainty, thanks to his knowledge from his past life. Letting Saria take on this quest alone was the same as sending her to her death, and eventually, the village would also be destroyed, as it would be left without a protector. That was the bleak future he had once experienced. With that in mind, the young disciple offered to team up with her. But his master refused, saying she could handle it on her own. Instead of wasting time trying to convince her that she wasn't strong enough, Gray cleverly told her he wanted to gain some real combat experience. He even goaded her, asking if she was afraid he'd just be a burden on her path. As clever as he was, his master pointed out the absurdity of what he just said. Their skill gap was now almost non-existent, to the point that she even had a hard time fighting him during their sparring matches. Even taking that into account, Saria reminded her disciple that a real battle was very different, especially when facing a monster lair like this one. This quest was extremely dangerous, which was why she didn't want Gray to risk his life, at least not until he had more combat experience. Her disciple was extremely disappointed to hear how resolute she was. Saria wouldn't budge from her stance, so he resorted to his last resort, an idea he wanted to share with his master. At first, she was very surprised, until Gray bluntly challenged her to a fight, promising to knock her unconscious and then head out alone to face the ogres. The situation grew tense, as the disciple had just challenged his master to a real fight. His sword pointed right at her. Gray awaited her response, realizing her student was just as stubborn as she was. Saria conceded. She didn't want him going alone, so she accepted his earlier offer for them to go together. All she cared about was his safe return. And yes, the One Piece is real. The two of them joined forces together and headed into the forest to confront the monsters. As the night grew deeper, they finally discovered the location of the lair. The clever monsters had used their surroundings to their advantage. They had built a lair with no escape route, just in case anyone dared to venture this far to challenge them. Saria thought these creatures must be very confident in their abilities, while Gray figured that it was actually a bigger disadvantage for the two of them, as they would have to fight carefully. Observing from a safe distance, she was quite surprised not to see the boss anywhere among the monsters, which made her wonder if it was hiding in the tent. If that was the case, it was good for them, because this way, they could take out many of the minions before the elite ogre could confront them. Discussing their strategy, Saria instructed her student to target the monsters from one flank, while she would handle the other. Putting the plan into action immediately, the two of them charged in, swords in hand. The confrontation began before the monsters even knew what was happening. The majestic Saria was already right above them, delivering a clean beheading strike, sending the creature's head flying like a ball to roll across the ground. As the first monster fell, the rest of them growled and roared at each other in their own language. The entire mob went berserk and switched into kill mode, readying their weapons to kill the intruders. But it didn't matter because our boy was in full-on beast mode, with the way he was slaughtering the entire horde. The guy was a literal one-man army, slicing through multiple monsters at once. The elegant Saria was no slouch either, showing off the impressive skills she'd learned from her father, Virgil. The two of them were unstoppable. Gray and Saria covered each other's backs perfectly. Within a few minutes, all the monsters in sight had been slain. Incidentally, she was actually quite impressed by Gray's unwavering resolve in a real fight. He had never been more ready, warning his master to stay on her guard too. However, something about this situation was giving him a bad feeling. This battle had been too easy for them. In fact, it was way too easy. Because if this was the level Saria was supposed to face, she could have defeated them all on her own without his help, and that made him feel uneasy, because whatever was in the tent had to be more terrifying than anything they had faced so far. And speaking of which, the creature's menacing eyes pierced through the darkness of the tent, staring at him from a distance. The very moment Gray's eyes met the creature's, a chill ran down his spine. Despite his strength, he flinched and told his master they had to leave immediately. Even Saria couldn't understand what had suddenly come over him. Without any explanation, he screamed at her to run, with a voice so full of fear that Saria didn't ask any further questions. She simply followed his lead and took off right after him. As they were running, you might think they would escape, but nope, because their terrifying opponent literally came leaping down from the sky in a massive jump. Gray was horrified as the monster landed, confronting the audacious humans. Saria's expression turned to one of astonishment, remarking that the boss monster had personally come to fight them. But then Gray dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. This wasn't the boss at all. Just as he was about to reveal the real boss's location, a monstrous voice roared from behind them. This provocative roar unleashed another horde of creatures to chase after them. This gruesome noise was jarring to Saria, but for the ogres it turned them into bloodthirsty berserkers. Saria shuddered in fear, unable to believe her own senses. There was a creature even more terrifying and imposing than an elite ogre, and it was commanding the entire horde. Finally, Gray revealed that they were up against an ogre general. He was the true boss of this monster den. I have to remind you guys, they were literally caught in the middle. On one side, an elite ogre was blocking their escape route. Turning back wasn't an option either because a massive horde was waiting for them along with the den's true boss. Saria expressed her shock, knowing full well that they couldn't face a monster like this even at their level. Their only chance of winning was to kill the elite ogre in front of them to escape. So she did exactly that by charging at the monster and clashing her weapon against its. Determined to win this battle, she took advantage of an opening and landed a clean cut on the creature's body. Blood sprayed from the gash. And while normally this would be a good sign, her worries only worsened when she noticed the wound healing back up again. Meanwhile, our boy was single-handedly fighting off dozens of monsters, sharing his knowledge about the ogre general's abilities. Apparently, its roar significantly boosts the monster's strength and recovery speed. Basically, they were facing a roided-out, buffed elite ogre, to the point where defeating a regular one was now difficult. Even Gray was struggling. As he knocked away a monster, he told Saria to cover his back. He instructed her to just buy some more time, which made her wonder what kind of miraculous plan he had cooked up, and our boy shared that in a situation like this, they only have one objective, which is to kill the ugliest one of them all, a bastard hiding behind his horde, and the battle for survival began. Gray swung his sword at one of the monsters, showing his frustration at being surrounded and attacked from two sides. He deflected the slash and spotted another ferocious monster aiming for him, continuously slashing his way through the enemies, focusing on clearing a path in front of him so he could reach his target. However, due to carelessness, he used so much force that his blade literally shattered. This was really troublesome as he was now without his only weapon that he was confident in using. He dodged a downward slash from the enhanced ogre and prioritized pulling out his spare sword. Yeah, this is the smartest MC I've seen in a while. Carrying a second sword means always being prepared. Anyway, Gray worried that his sword wouldn't last long, and coming to his rescue, his master threw her spare sword towards him, giving him another chance to win. With both spare swords in hand, he had a better fighting chance. But, even that wasn't enough to kill every single one of these monsters. There were too many obstacles on the way to the ogre general while simultaneously defeating its minions, but he still believed in his abilities. This guy went berserk, unleashing a lightning-fast slash that swept through his enemies. His forward momentum was halted when one of the ogres tried to attack him. Luckily, he dodged it and quickly blocked the attack. The battle was wearing him out, but he was still making significant progress in dealing with the monsters in front of him. The ogre general felt threatened and decided to let out a second roar, to Gray's horror. The already enhanced creatures just received another power-up. This guy was not having a good time as he now struggled even more to deal with them. Gray realized that the ogre general was smart enough to see through his strategy. Now that it knew what the human was trying to do, the ogre general continuously roared to rile up its minions to fight. Blocking an attack, Gray pushed the monsters away to charge straight ahead. A horde of monsters was ready to greet him, and instead of taking them on, one by one, he effectively cut down those in his way, but it also left him covered in scratches and injuries. The bloodbath was draining his stamina as he struggled to get through their relentless barrage of attacks. Caught off guard, he was tackled by one of the ogres and pinned to the ground. It was looking really bad for him as the ogres had him right where they wanted him. Fortunately, in their frenzy, they lost their coordination as one of them slashed. At its own kind, without a second thought, Gray silently realized their strategy was probably to wear down his swords. While he was lost in thought, a beefy ogre swung a powerful punch to crush his head. This was a life or death situation and he obviously couldn't afford to take the hit, so he used his sword to mitigate the damage, but even so, our boy got slammed straight into the ground just from the impact. Finding himself on the brink of death, this man still managed to get back up in his battered state. That's the definition of a badass, with the previous attack having destroyed his spare sword. He was now left with only one sword and dozens of ogres to kill, along with their boss. Once again, the odds were against him. In fact, it was nearly impossible to get out of this. Despite having gone through a regression, he fully understood his current situation. Gray simply couldn't win. Not against so many bloodthirsty monsters wearing him down, so he decided to change his strategy. He yelled for his master to run while he could still act as a decoy for her escape. Saria heard this and smiled. Refusing to treat him like that, she was still facing the enhanced elite ogre. But Gray didn't understand why she was still determined to fight. He reassured her to run because he would catch up soon after. But Saria refused his offer, and revealed the horrifying truth that she had lost the ability to run. She had suffered a deep gash on her thigh, crushing Gray's hopes to dust. Even that approach was now impossible. There was no other path left but to march straight to their deaths. Swinging his sword in a rage, he thought about why he was given a regression. Despite carrying such a heavy mission, it was all about to come to an end. Tragically, his last sword also chipped and shattered into pieces, yet he still couldn't accept the truth. Despite losing his weapon, Gray refused to see this as the end of his life. If only he could use the power from the future, that terrifying ability that rivaled the Purifier and could injure him. If he could use it for even a moment, these monsters would be torn to shreds. Trying to recall the feeling he experienced that time, he channeled energy into his broken sword, entering a meditative state, and when he opened his eyes again, Gray was no longer the weakling he once was. A single black flame slash tore through the ogres, turning them to dust with his blazing black sword. Even Saria couldn't understand what was happening, but it seemed our boy was still in control, because even after unlocking his dark power, he still gave her a reassuring smile. In the next few seconds, Gray cut down every creature in his sight, including the ogre general. Even his master couldn't comprehend what the hell just happened. She was too busy focusing on the elite ogre in front of her, but now that the ogre general was killed, and the enhancement ability seemed to have disappeared, Saria understood that now. She could easily kill the monster as it could no longer regenerate. Using a knockoff version of the Judgment Annihilation Slash, she cut the creature down. Declaring that the elite ogre was nothing without its master, they had finally won. The two had overcome all odds and won the battle, despite miraculously taking down an entire ogre horde. Gray still apologized for breaking her sword. Saria told him it was nothing compared to having her life saved in return. She picked up the sword and wanted to ask him about the technique he used at the end, but before she could finish her sentence, our boy collapsed to the ground, completely unconscious from the side effects, leaving his master to wordly shout his name. The perspective shifts to Gray's inner world. He wondered about his surroundings, and saw nothing but a floating, chained door in front of him. He was utterly confused. Until the door began to emit the same dark energy he wielded through his powers, a sudden realization dawned on him. This was his own power, and he wondered what would happen if he could break through that door. After all, he might be able to claim that power and make it his own. Determined to try, he stepped forward. But the very moment he took his first step, a deadly sensation enveloped his body. It scared the living daylights out of him, and that was just after a single step. Gray was so terrified that he had to back away. He didn't have all the answers about the source of his power, but one thing had become crystal clear to him right then. If he dared to provoke the use of his power in his current state, he would die, sure as shit, and that wasn't just an empty threat. The feeling was so terrifying it made him cry. From the void, a voice seeped into his mind, praising him for his recent decision before Gray could process anything else. He woke up in a bed in a state of panic, his master right by his side, overjoyed that he was finally awake. Worried, he asked where he was. She explained that she had brought him to the village infirmary as quickly as she could. This dude was actually out cold for a full 5 days, and I'm glad the author didn't say it was 3 days, like in so many other stories. Anyway, she had been terrified for his life, while Gray was coming to terms with the fact that he had been recovering for nearly a week due to the strain from the technique he used. Even Saria thought he had done something extraordinary in that battle. It was the very definition of defying all odds, but she was still worried about his body's condition, and asked if he could move. To test it, our boy tried to lift his arm, but he couldn't do a damn thing. He could only barely use it after mustering a lot of strength, but in his current state, there was no way he could hold a sword with an injury like this. Hell, he probably couldn't even jerk off. So we need to sort this out quickly, and then there's the bruising on his arm from the fight. Saria grew more and more worried about his condition, knowing he couldn't move his body normally. Gray confirmed that he was now completely helpless. Even his master admitted his arm wouldn't be back to normal anytime soon, revealing that every single bone in his arm had been shattered to pieces. This revelation surprised the kid because, strangely, he didn't feel any pain at all. That was actually thanks to the magic potion therapy he had received. The kid's jaw dropped because this stuff was normally ridiculously expensive, and yet she had just used a whole vial on him. Saria explained that there was nothing to worry about, because the village chief himself had rewarded them with it. The kid couldn't believe his ears. He didn't even know the village chief, yet he'd received a vial of magic potion paid for by him. Saria thought he was being an idiot for not understanding his situation, so she spelled it out for him. Gray was officially the village's savior and hero. Before he could digest what she had just said, the village chief burst in to greet the boy, thanking him for everything. To highlight the greatness of his feat, the chief reminded him that an ogre general was so strong it would take an entire town to fight off just one of them. A creature of that caliber had been threatening their village. And yet, a single kid was able to punch through everything, clear the way, and destroy the monster, ensuring the village's safety. For that, the chief was incredibly grateful. It was thanks to the brave efforts of the boy and his master that their lives were no longer under threat. Unable to take all the credit, Gray thought they were exaggerating what he had done. But the chief thought he was the one downplaying his own achievements. After thinking for a moment, Gray reflected on the outcome. He figured the chief's words were probably right. Remembering his past life, this place had been burned to ashes by the rampaging ogres. That was the significance of his achievement. The village chief was more than willing to explain at length just how great he was, but for now, he was focused on the boy's mission to pass the entrance exam for the World Union Academy. Speaking of which, Gray just remembered his real goal. He had recklessly gone off to wipe out a monster nest just a few weeks before the exam. With all the time he'd wasted, he only had 2 days left until the exam date. Oh, and by the way, just walking there would take a full 3 days. His best option was to travel by horse to make it on time, but he was broke and had no money to buy one. Making a sudden request, he begged the village chief to lend him a horse for the journey. Luckily, the village chief had anticipated that the boy would make such a request, which was why he had already prepared the best horse for his trip. Saria smiled, revealing their original plan was to carry him there, even if he hadn't woken up today. Some people really have your back despite your troubles. Just like Gray's friends here, and I hope we all get to meet people like that in our lives. Gray Gray stepped out of the infirmary to find the entire village chanting his name and cheering him on for his exam. They wanted him to do his best and didn't hesitate to thank him for what he had done. The villagers even supported him with a bag of money, each person chipping in a little so he could register for the exam and support himself at the academy. The kid was incredibly grateful to the villagers who had shown him so much love through their support. He also joked that it would be embarrassing if he failed the exam and came back. But Saria was extremely confident in her student, pointing out that the other applicants weren't capable of defeating an ogre general on their own. But that wasn't the only concern. The kid was worried about his arm since it was still wrecked and he didn't know when it would heal. In response, his master suggested that he should make use of his left arm in the meantime. Although his left hand was perfectly fine, the problem was that he was more used to his right, but his teacher thought it wouldn't be an issue with his skill level. Gray shared his worries, saying that the level of the entrance exam might be too much for him, to the point where having only one arm would hold him back. But even so, Saria knew that the teachers or examiners at the academy all had a keen eye. Once they saw his talent, they would choose him. The kid climbed onto his horse, while his teacher confidently declared that he would pass. That was the only possible outcome. Thanking her for everything she had done, he promised not to fail. Remembering the scene of the village being razed in his previous life, he was happy that these people got a second chance along with him. The world had started to change from this point on, and he would make sure to influence the future with his newfound power. In the next scene, the kid had finally reached his destination, looking straight ahead. He gazed at the grandeur of the World Union Academy in the arena. The proctor announced the distribution of exam tickets. All the candidates were to remain in the arena. At a glance, there were a lot of applicants, but only a small number, 20 people, would secure a spot in the class. They argued about how the quota changed every year. Since there were years, the academy even accepted 50 people, while in rare cases, they only took one. So the selection rules were clearly not absolute. Anyway, Professor Ariel took the stage and stepped forward. She addressed the candidates and explained that they would have to receive the paper being presented. With a snap of her fingers, a golden vortex opened up, releasing magical energy, and automatically materialized an exam ticket in each candidate's hand. The kid took his ticket. His number was 513 for the swordsmanship course. Professor Ariel added that their tickets only showed the most important details, but there was nothing to worry about since the process was the same every year. She also confirmed that the academy didn't care about a person's age or gender, nationality, or class. In other words, they really couldn't give a damn what you are. They didn't even bother to know the candidates' names. Those with passing numbers would be asked for more information, but for the rest of the candidates here, it didn't matter. Professor Ariel even confirmed they could use fake names, once again proving the academy didn't care. Anyway, trouble found our boy because he showed up today without a sword, yet he was assigned to the swordsmanship course. This made him question the validity of the system. Professor Ariel continued humorously, saying she assigned courses to everyone based on their appearance. I know she's supposed to be perceptive or something, but it's hilarious that just a minute ago she was going on about discrimination, and then she goes and says this. Ariel didn't mind correcting the course details, in case she had assigned them incorrectly. Even the examinees thought there was no way she could assign courses just by looking at their faces, especially with so many people. They highly suspected that the academy must have investigated them beforehand to know this. The possibility of mind-reading magic was also brought up. Professor Ariel didn't address any of their concerns. All she cared about was that no one was complaining about their assigned course. So, next, she decided to reveal everyone's exam schedule. The details were printed right onto the slips. Gray was worried because he was scheduled for the first day, giving him no time for his hand to heal. Ariel revealed that this exam would only be conducted once and it would decide everything. If a candidate was late, the only result was immediate disqualification. She also reminded them that their schedules were strict and would not be changed or debated upon request. This was bad news for Gray, who was struggling with his recovery. He was begging his body to pull off a miracle and heal him by tomorrow. The next day arrived, and what do you know? The poor guy's arm hadn't healed at all. He had no choice but to take the exam in this condition. Gray's number was called and he begrudgingly stepped up. He tried to calm himself down in an attempt to stay positive about the situation. Checking his left arm, it seemed to be fine, and he could also move his right hand if he put enough strength into it. His current strategy was to carefully observe the examiner's moves and figure out a winning tactic from there. He was watching a match between a candidate and an examiner. The applicant just blindly charged into attack, but when his attack ended, the examiner was completely unharmed and stood there casually, waiting for his next move. The candidate dragged his sword again to unleash another slash, but even that blow was useless. It was blocked, and not only that, the examiner deflected his blade before sending him flying with a finishing blow. His body slammed hard onto the ground. The examiner announced the result of the test and asked him to leave the premises. You might be thinking that Gray figured something out, but the funny thing is, this dude literally gave up and accepted that he was about to get his ass handed to him. His number was called to enter the arena. Gray sized up his chances, realizing he obviously couldn't beat an examiner who destroyed a candidate, who was even bigger than him. Inside the arena, our boy was given the right to strike first. Despite that, he fully understood this fight would be one-sided, but he still had to make some kind of impression. The match began with Gray rushing in to attack. He recalled his master's advice, who told him to utilize his entire body to deliver a powerful slash instead of just his arms. Putting her advice into action, he figured the only way he could deal with the loss of his right arm was to use other muscle groups to compensate. and so he unleashed his first swing, but the examiner easily dodged it. Even now, Gray found himself struggling to fight in his usual style. After all, even though he was trying to compensate for his right arm, it didn't change. The fact that he was at a huge disadvantage here. The examiner countered by trying to slash him down, but to Gray's surprise, the sword moved so slowly, it was as if he could read its trajectory without even rushing. So, our boy successfully parried the attack, though he could still feel the weight of the examiner's force behind the blow. At the same time, he determined that the examiner's technique wasn't as refined as Saria's, so if he could focus on the techniques he learned from her, there was a chance he could capitalize on an opportunity and create an opening. With that strategy in mind, Gray charged in with all his might in an effort to overwhelm the instructor. And oh, the instructor was actually being pushed back. His speed was the weak point. Gray found himself growing confident, realizing he could easily take this examiner down. His master's words flashed through his mind again. Their blades clashed once more, but Gray overpowered his opponent with an all-out parry, ready to end the fight with his newfound confidence. Gray continued his relentless assault while the instructor tried his best to regain control of the fight's tempo. Even though our boy had seen through his opponent's technique, nullifying it with a handicap was still a difficult task. He took advantage of the speed gap and launched a straight thrust, but it was swatted aside. The difference in pure strength was simply too great. Breaking the instructor's stance was easier said than done with 2 hands, let alone 1. Even so, Gray's aggression was making the nerd's movements sloppier by the second. It was a bit of a gamble, but he could try his luck here. With a clear plan in mind, Gray let the instructor push him to the edge of the stage, leaving a huge opening in his defense. Just as planned, 4 Eyes took the bait and rushed in for the finishing blow. The instructor fell for the oldest trick in the book. He went for a wide-open swing just as Gray predicted. The young warrior adjusted his stance and let the slash come at him. Nothing leaves you more open than a reckless and greedy attack. A wide, predictable swing was exactly what he needed to take advantage of his speed. In a flash, he closed in on the instructor's unguarded flank. No matter how big the power difference is, you can't defend against a critical hit from behind. Just milliseconds away from landing the winning thrust, the referee stepped in to signal the end of the match. Gray held back and lowered his sword. The match was over, but it felt a bit too short. With the test time limit up, the referee announced the match result as a draw. The young man gritted his teeth in frustration. He had failed after all the hard work he put in. He couldn't make it. He gripped his trusty sword for a moment before letting his hand go limp. Gray walked off the stage and accepted the result with grace. He'd done his best. If he couldn't even beat an instructor, injured or not, his lofty goals were further away than he thought. On the bright side, his arm would be healed by next year, so he could be at 100% to retake the entrance exam. Regardless of the outcome, this was a valuable experience to be grateful for. A week had passed since Gray's close call against that 4-eyed guy. Today, the faculty of the World Union Academy gathered in meeting room number 53 to discuss the results of the entrance exams. The white-haired old man started the meeting by letting his colleagues freely voice their thoughts on this year's batch. Immediately, complaints rang throughout the room. For this year, they had devised a method for every professor to observe the exams together, which was rather inefficient and tedious. Of course, there were some who preferred this format. They couldn't just pass up a promising talent for the faculty's convenience. Graham steered the discussion away from the exam system and back to the hopeful students. Starting with the swordsmanship department, he summoned the magical records of each candidate to evaluate those who passed one last time. Naturally, those who outright defeated the examiners passed. Those who couldn't complete the task would be judged based on the qualities they displayed and how they held their own during those 15 minutes of engagement. Aside from those who wiped the floor with the instructors, they had narrowed down the list of outstanding applicants to numbers 5, 217, and 753. Everyone agreed to just pick those 3. If they added any lesser talents, the poor kids wouldn't be able to keep up with the classes. No one objected to where the line was drawn. So, the successful candidates for the swordsmanship department were confirmed and finalized. Or at least it was supposed to be, until a cheerful voice brought up candidate number 513, Gray Lee. That voice belonged to none other than the mysterious red-headed Professor Ariel. Since she had mentioned an unfamiliar number, the other professors pulled up the recorded footage. They had to admit that if there had been just one more second, the young man might have won, but he had to rely on a trap just to beat an examiner. The academy might be too tough for the kid. While those with a keen eye for swordsmanship could see his solid technique, his lack of power and the clear gap from beginning to end were obvious. In short, the professors of the swordsmanship department rejected the idea of accepting examinee 513 into the academy. While they were busy mocking the kid's shortcomings, Professor Ariel looked at her colleagues as if they were a bunch of useless idiots. Everyone in this room had watched the footage, but not a single one of them noticed what she had seen. If everyone was this blind, perhaps the format of the exam was a complete waste of time. A day after the final deliberation, the examinees were called back to the city square. They were told to gather at 11 in the morning. The air was thick with tension, and everyone was hoping to receive the coveted acceptance. The moment had finally come. A representative from the academy announced loudly that 6 examinees had passed for the swordsmanship department. Everyone clutched their slips, praying they were one of the 6. The first to be called were examinees number 5 and 217. Immediately, their papers burst into flames. Next were examinees number 432, 615, 753, and 925. That was all. Out of hundreds of people, only 6 were talented enough to be accepted into the most prestigious training academy in the world. Gray had come here today with a sliver of hope, only to have it completely crushed by the reality that he probably wasn't good enough. The successful candidates were instructed to cross the bridge and complete their admission procedures by the end of the day. Those who passed were naturally happy and excited to step into the life of the elite, while the failures hung their heads in disappointment, wallowing in their failure. After finishing with the swordsmanship department, the representative unexpectedly announced that one examinee had been chosen through the God's Eye special admission. Of course, it was none other than examinee number 513, Gray freaking Lee. His slip burned with a different color than the others before it. The bright blue flame couldn't help but draw everyone's attention. Just when he thought he'd have to train and recover from his injuries for another year, Gray was let through. The other examinees around him scoffed when they heard about the God's Eye special admission. Gray had absolutely no idea what he'd just gotten himself into. This was the first time he'd ever heard of this God's Eye business. Most people considered it a bullshit admission, just a way to let the undeserving in through the back door. A sign of the World Union Academy's decline. Hearing the venomous whispers around him, Gray didn't like being called a backdoor admission. He wondered how he'd been chosen, considering he had no significant connections. His master couldn't possibly have that much pull at the academy. While the rejects were mocking the sole God's Eye admission, a bald old hermit scolded them for disrespecting a long-standing tradition. According to the bald hermit, this admission was a prestigious category that had produced countless heroes over the past century. As expected, the rejects also mocked the old hermit for being a fossil. Sure, the God's Eye was praised as the birthplace of heroes back in the day, but not anymore. Recent God's Eye candidates included Amy White, Bella Albright, Leek Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield. These four had one thing in common. Everyone considered them complete and pathetic failures, but we've heard these names before. In the near future, Amy White would ascend to become a sword saint, Bella Albright would become the great sage, and Jacob Bloomfield would take on the title of divine archer. The three of them would reach the pinnacle of their professions, becoming a key force against the Purifier. Now, the name Graylee would be mentioned alongside these legends. The successful candidates were welcomed and given uniforms to change into. The entrance ceremony would begin shortly, and the new recruits had to gather at the square in front of the main office. Gray tried on his new outfit, and it fit like a glove. The black blazer with its gold trim and the academy's crest looked incredibly sharp. He went from feeling like a failure to looking dapper alongside his classmates. When they arrived at the square, a few of the new recruits were confused. There was nothing there. The confusion was cleared up when an academy staff member ran toward them, looking apologetic. He explained that there was a slight delay in preparing for the ceremony due to a mix-up. Luckily, it wouldn't take long to fix. To do so, the new recruits had to step back a little further to allow for the setup. The new recruits followed the staff member's instructions and watched with skepticism. The staff member knelt and started fiddling with the ground. After a moment of preparation, he placed his hand on the floor and activated a giant magic circle. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of seats appeared out of thin air, arranged in a Colosseum style, emerging from the magic circle. The new recruits were completely flabbergasted. They had never seen magic on this scale before. In mere seconds, the square had transformed into a proper arena, complete with seats and a stage. The staff member apologized again for the delay and instructed the new recruits to sit wherever they liked. Still reeling from the absurd display of magic, they complied. A few of the more knowledgeable recruits recognized the use of teleportation magic to literally summon an entire arena. Gray quietly took a seat in a middle row. He figured this was the academy's way of holding an entrance ceremony on a grand scale near the main building. Basically, they were flexing the power of the World Union Academy. Once everyone was seated, other recruits remarked that the number of seats was a bit excessive. There were only 30 of them, but there were hundreds of seats. Well, that's because, as the name World Union Academy suggests, this academy brings together the best of the best from all over the world. If you looked up at the sky, you'd understand what that truly meant. Dozens of airships and dragon carriages soared overhead, blotting out the Sunday. Looking up, Gray recognized the largest magic airship as the Stratus Queen. He'd been on that behemoth before, when he was just cannon fodder for the Purifier subjugation squad. It truly lived up to its reputation. Bringing out something so grand for a simple entrance ceremony was just another way to show off for the new recruits. The World Union Academy certainly knew how to make a statement. Once all the ships had landed safely, the students who had passed the rigorous entrance exams in other parts of the world emerged. They took the remaining seats, filling up the stands. Once everyone was gathered, it was time to start. The staff member, who had summoned the arena, signaled the beginning of the rest of their lives. After all the flashy displays of influence, the entrance ceremony proceeded with a brief speech from the principal. Gray was feeling a little bored in his seat. Even though he was enrolling in the world's most prestigious academy, the whole ceremony felt like just another tedious assembly. Next, the principal called the top students of each department to the stage. The guy sitting next to Gray stood up. The blonde-haired boy's name was Leonhardt, the valedictorian of the swordsmanship department. As he confidently walked down the stairs, rumors about his incredible feat of defeating the examiner in the blink of an eye began to spread. Some even said this rookie was already on par with any of the swordsmanship professors. Leonhardt Appius looked like a spy, tasked with creating a fake family with a female assassin and a mind-reading little girl. Gray wasn't particularly impressed, just a little curious. Before starting his speech, Leonhardt confirmed that he was allowed to speak freely from the heart. When given the signal, he turned to the other new recruits with a sharp gaze. He began his speech by lodging a formal complaint with the academy. First of all, He congratulated his peers for being rightfully accepted. He considered it a great honor to be among the best of the current generation. Leonhardt hoped that they would all graduate and become capable individuals who could make meaningful contributions to the world. To that end, they must work together. He looked forward to the day he and his peers would soar high as proud students of the prestigious World Union Academy. With that out of the way, he pointed out that there was one person among them, someone who was utterly undeserving of being in this square. He directed this accusation straight at Professor Ariel, the supervisor for the Divine Eye's special admissions. She was quite shocked to be called out by a freshman on the very first day of school. Professor Ariel asserted that every single student here had passed a rigorous exam. They might not be as brilliant as Leonhardt, but they had proven they were completely worthy. Curious and amused, she asked the conceited rookie why he was barking like a puppy. Without holding back, Leonhardt bluntly mentioned the mysterious candidate admitted through an outdated backdoor system. Just like everyone else, he considered the Divine Eye's special admission slot as just a way to sneak unqualified students into the academy. Leonhardt roared that the specially admitted students should reveal themselves, return the prestigious uniform, and get lost in shame. His words and decisiveness seemed to have swayed the other rookies. Meanwhile, the person being criticized was trying to keep a low profile. Luckily, that hostile nerd didn't know Gray's face. If he just kept quiet, he wouldn't get into trouble, right? Professor Ariel had to step in and break the tension, praising this year's batch of students for their liveliness. Refusing to back down, Leonhardt pressed his point even harder about admitting students through an outdated course. Getting a little annoyed with the blonde boy, Professor Ariel spoke with a hidden meaning, asking if he was confident that he could defeat the kid she had chosen for her course. Leon had to take a few steps back as he felt the pressure from the mysterious professor. He tried to stammer out a reply, but couldn't. Gritting his teeth and composing himself, Leonhardt confidently replied that he could beat that unqualified student to a pulp. Ariel had expected such an answer. She liked boys with an attitude, so she proposed a bet. She was willing to bet her job and that kid's future in this academy. Gray was not a fan of this kind of bet at all. Leonhardt asked if the bet was a direct duel with the specially admitted kid, but Professor Ariel wouldn't do something so boring and crude. She was also certain that if her boy went all out, little Leon would end up dead in a ditch. As an educator, she couldn't possibly put the life of a promising student in danger. Her words cut through Leonhardt's pride like a hot knife through butter. If she was trying to provoke him into making the bet, it had definitely worked. Professor Ariel suggested they bet on monster subjugation instead. That way, it would be a little safer for all parties involved. Besides, she knew that Leonhardt was better at fighting monsters than people. The details were simple. Both participants had to kill the monster she chose as the target. Each round, the target monster would increase in strength. Whoever gives up first and fails to subjugate the target would lose. If her boy loses, she'll willingly give up her esteemed position as a professor, and she'll expel every special admission student under her management. But if little Leon loses, he'll have to do whatever she asks. I know many of you would agree to be the red-headed professor's slave in a heartbeat. Before accepting, Leonhardt asked what the first monster target would be. Despite being confident he could handle and eliminate any opponent, he didn't want to get involved in anything crazy. After a moment of consideration, she came up with the perfect first target. She wanted the head of an ogre general on her desk. If that was too easy for little Leon, she would be happy to up the difficulty. But based on the crowd's reaction, that wouldn't be necessary. While everyone else thought her request was outrageous, Gray was trying to figure out why she chose an ogre general, a monster he had already killed, to be specific. On the other hand, Leon slammed his hand on the podium and vehemently protested that an ogre general was not a monster someone could subjugate single-handedly. Seeing the blonde boy object, she lowered the difficulty and set the time frame to a full year. Little Leon still wouldn't bite. He argued that if someone could single-handedly kill a disaster-class monster with just 1 year of training, then there'd be no point to this absurd bet. This coward demanded a more realistic target, and then it dawned on him that this clever woman had deliberately chosen a monster no one could defeat so they could end the bet without a clear winner. Since he wouldn't stop whining, Professor Ariel relented and added another clause to the bet. If it ends in a draw, little Leon wins. In other words, if her boy fails to take down the ogre general within a year, she'll willingly resign and expel all her special admission students. With all the terms stacked in Leon's favor, he'd look like a total coward if he still refused. This knockoff Lloyd forger had to realize he was being played here, and that the outcome was already decided. But he got swept up in the professor's manipulation, forced into accepting a seemingly sure-win bet. Just to be sure, he asked if a weakened or injured ogre general would count. Needless to say, the monster had to be in its natural fighting state for the deal to count. The professor's eye gleamed under her monocle as her magic formed a contract. Every detail was listed and engraved in the magical contract. All little Leon had to do was sign it if he was ready. With the entire faculty and all the other freshmen as witnesses, he willingly signed his name on the mystical document. After sealing the deal, he hesitantly asked if the backdoor kid could actually win. Professor Ariel didn't bother to answer directly. The other professors just sat back and watched, seemingly used to the antics of the red-headed old fox. They all saw her as a mage who was past her prime, bored and just pulling ridiculous stunts for fun. Sitting in his seat, Gray sighed in defeat, as the bet that decided his future was made official without his say. He also realized that she had deliberately worded the terms to include the ogre general he had already killed within the time frame. This bet was a done deal from the very beginning. Professor Ariel had played Leon and everyone else, and Gray was the only one who saw through it. She really fought dirty. But having someone like that on his side was a huge advantage. After the disastrous bet, the opening ceremony came to an end, and the rookies were herded into their first lecture, The Fundamentals of Magic. The professor in charge of the class admitted it was a bit surprising to start lectures on the very first day of school, but he wanted his students to get used to this pace. At this academy, they couldn't afford to waste even a single day. Today, they would start with the most basic of basics, the simple use of magic. Inside the human body exists an invisible energy called ether. One can control the magic circuits within the body and tap into untold sources of power. Gray was initially afraid he wouldn't be able to keep up with the classes, but this first lecture seemed manageable. He had heard similar explanations at the subjugation training camp. However, he was unlucky with his class placement. Of all the introductory magic classes, he ended up in the same one as Leonhardt Apius. If everyone found out he was the hated Divine Eye special admissions student, he could say goodbye to his peace and quiet. While he was lost in thought, the professor noticed and called him out for looking bored with the lecture. The professor felt insulted that a rookie had looked away less than 5 minutes into his introductory course. Gray immediately apologized for his wandering gaze. However, he found it strange that the professor singled him out even though he was sitting way in the back of the hall. The professor escalated the situation and demanded a demonstration from the inattentive student. He looked bored during an introductory class, so that must mean he can use basic magic, right? Gray was no pushover. He politely stated that he specialized in swordsmanship. He thought it would be fine if he couldn't use magic. The professor snapped that even if someone uses a sword in a real fight, a warrior still needs to learn the basics to coordinate with an allied mage. Learning the basics of magic and getting a feel for it was the bare minimum a swordsman could do. At that moment, Gray recalled hearing the same thing from the lectures at the training camp. In that case, today's lecture would probably end with the same spell. To confirm, he asked if today's lecture was aimed at learning the simple, yet effective spell, Ether Bullet. Since he knew its name, the professor assumed he could use it. Gray thanked his lucky stars for the hellish training camp he'd had to grind through. Because this would be a good opportunity for a proper demonstration, the professor decided to turn it into a one-on-one match, and called this year's top swordsman, Leon, to the stage. The blonde dude happily stood up and showed his respect to the professor. After that, he explained that he'd been trained in both swordsmanship and magic even before enrolling, so it might be a bit risky for a regular person to face him. The professor asserted that no matter how big the skill gap was, ether bullets weren't lethal, so there was no need to hold back. Plus, he revealed that Gray was this year's God's Eye student, knowing full well how much Leon despised the unknown student who got in through the back door. Every student in the lecture hall turned to Gray, burning his face into their memories. This was a setup from the start. He couldn't even get through a single day without some damn professor spilling his beans. That damn old geezer had intentionally revealed his identity with malicious intent. Hearing he had a chance to literally shoot a bullet at the guy he hated, Leon readily accepted, wanting to teach the backdoor kid a lesson. This was a chance to show an unqualified nobody from the outside what the World Union Academy was really like. With veins popping from anger, he demanded Gray get his ass down there. This was not how our boys' first day was supposed to go. On stage, they face each other while the professor, adding fuel to the fire, explained the rules. He would give the signal, and both sides would fire an ether bullet at their opponent. Gray had only spent a few days learning basic magic at the training camp. Sure, the professor said the bullets weren't lethal, but that didn't mean they wouldn't hurt. As soon as the signal to start was given, Leonhardt concentrated a large amount of ether in his hand, determined to show the difference in power between a real student and a fake one. Pushed into a corner and forced to defend himself, Gray also focused and manipulated his ether, pouring all his existing knowledge into one desperate attempt. The entire lecture hall fell silent as they witnessed a massive black hole, threatening to swallow a tiny little bullet. Both Leon and Gray were stunned. Neither of them had expected this. As predicted, the tiny ether bullet was completely swallowed by the raging black hole. Leon's fear was visible in his eyes as the clearly lethal spell closed in on him. In a panic, the professor raised his hand and did his best to prevent the worst-case scenario with his own magic. A golden barrier stopped the seemingly unstoppable advance of the abnormal ether bullet. It dampened most of the attack's force, but it was a close call. He had made the mistake of underestimating it, and the golden barrier began to show dangerous cracks under the pressure. Finally, the black hole ether bullet reached its limit and exploded, shattering the magic barrier into millions of tiny specks of light. The subsequent explosion sent the lecture hall into chaos. The freshmen shut their eyes and braced for impact. As for the target, the kid Leon was knocked flat on his back, screaming his head off. Realizing he'd messed up, the professor immediately ran over to the swordsmanship department's rising star to make sure he was okay. Leon got up on his own, dusted himself off, and reassured the professor he was fine. After confirming the blonde was all right, the professor turned his attention to the one who had nearly blown the whole place up if the barrier hadn't lessened the impact. That abnormal ether bullet could have killed Leon and injured many others. Even among the veteran magic professors, no one in the academy could create an ether bullet that powerful. He was dying to know what the young man had done to generate such terrifying destructive power. Gray himself was confused. The thing he just unleashed was definitely on a completely different level from the weak-ass thing his opponent had thrown. Could the magic he learned back in the subjugation squad be different from what was taught at the academy? He asked the professor if he'd done something wrong, but the old man was quite certain that what he'd fired was, in fact, an ether bullet. The only obvious difference was the quality of the magic. What Gray had just used to enhance the spell wasn't ordinary ether. That size and power could only be achieved through the use of hypercompressed ether. Not a single freshman had ever heard of, let alone understood, this term. Hypercompressed ether was something that even experienced professors had difficulty creating and researching, yet this controversial student casually used it to modify a basic spell. No one in this academy could replicate that. Now, the students were starting to feel a mix of respect and fear for the boy who got in through the God's Eye special admission. They also argued that Gray should have been enrolled in the magic department. As far as he remembered, all the magic he learned from the subjugation squad was exactly like the one he just used. In the whole group, Gray was one of the least talented at it. Still not convinced he was using some kind of enhanced ether, he summoned another ether bullet and insisted that anyone could do this with enough practice. To his confusion, the professor just laughed like a madman in response. Gray didn't know what to do, so he just stood there dumbfounded. The professor's attitude did a complete 180. At the beginning of the class, he'd been openly hostile, but now he was trying to recruit this special admission student into the magic department. Gray politely declined the enthusiastic offer. He'd always been told he had no talent for magic, so he couldn't imagine himself pursuing it now. The professor found this refusal absurd. If a young man who could create hyper-compressed ether through compression was considered untalented, then everyone else might as well give up on magic. He even called Gray an unparalleled prodigy, even by the Academy's standards. Whoever said the kid had no talent for magic must have been smoking something illegal. The freshmen watched the scene unfold in silence. They saw the strict professor turn into a completely different person as he desperately tried to convince Gray to switch to the magic department. In his opinion, it would be a huge loss to the world if Gray didn't pursue magic hell. It would be a crime against the arcane arts. Faced with all the flattery directed at him, all the young man could do was laugh at the absurdity of it all. Then, he recalled hearing the term ether compression technique once before. It was another fine day at the training camp, and one of the heroes was giving a lecture. She recounted that in the past, humans didn't know about OD, also known as origin drive, existed. Due to that gap in knowledge, casting magic properly was very difficult. People had to constantly compress the ether in their bodies to achieve the desired effect with a spell. This primitive method only gathered a tiny bit of OD. The instructor, Bella Albright, the great sage and future strongest mage, found it laughable how they practiced magic just a decade ago. Gray asked the professor if he had ever heard of OD. This question stumped the old man. He was completely unfamiliar with the term. Judging by that reaction, it seemed the world had yet to discover this revolutionary magical concept at this point in time. If that was the case, then the basics Gray learned in the subjugation squad could be considered knowledge from the future. He finally realized he had to be careful not to leak this kind of information. For the last time, he refused the relentless offer to switch to a different department. His true love was the sword, so he had to decline. The professor sighed in defeat and helplessly accepted the young man's decision to stick with swordsmanship, but he also left the door wide open for Gray, an invitation to transfer departments whenever he wanted. Feeling a headache coming on, the young man awkwardly thanked the enthusiastic old man for his generous offer. After that demonstration, both participants were asked to return to their seats. The professor promised he would never scold Gray in class again. In fact, he wouldn't mind if the kid just left if he got bored. The professor believed that these rudimentary lessons were too basic for a prodigy like Gray. Gray walked down the stairs while enduring hostile glares. Now he walked with the respect of his professor and peers. Meanwhile, his victim was still standing on the ruined stage, blushing and feeling his lion's heart flutter for Lord Gray. He couldn't see what Lionheart looked like down there, but Gray certainly felt a chill run down his spine. After his first class, he received a private note from Professor Ariel asking him to meet her in her office after class. He was basically being summoned out of the blue. It would be a pain if old Professor Carlos was behind this sudden summons. After wandering around for a few minutes, he finally found the office door bearing the seal of the Divine Eye. He was about to knock, but the door gently swung open, gently letting him in. Taking the unlocked door as an invitation, Gray respectfully stepped inside while offering a formal greeting. Before he could even finish his sentence, he sensed a sharp blade rushing toward him from the side. Gray's reflexes kicked in automatically as he drew his sword to defend himself. His grip on the sword was a bit unorthodox, but it did the job in a pinch. He managed to parry the sneak attack and the attacker along with it. As the assailant was knocked back, Gray realized he had acted purely on instinct this time. He wanted to confront his attacker, but it was just a young, blue-haired girl who couldn't even hold her sword steady. Looking closer, Gray realized he knew this girl all too well. This shorty would become an unshakable pillar of humanity and hope in the future. Gray's attention then shifted to the desk at the back of the office, and the woman sitting on it praised his quick reaction. Professor Ariel was pleased to confirm that her eye hadn't been wrong in judging the young man during the entrance exam. There were two other men in the room, Ariel's colleagues, who were still skeptical about the Divine Eye's newest member. They judged Bella's movements as flawless, but her sword was knocked out of her hand far too easily. Hearing that name, Gray's past life memories of the ultimate mage came flooding back. Who would have thought the archmage looked so prim and proper when she was young? Meanwhile, Ariel was giving her colleagues a hard time, making them admit they were wrong, instead of making excuses. In the end, the other professors had to cough up the cash and hand over their winnings to their gambling-addicted colleague. They had observed the split-second exchange at the door and had to admit that Gray was here for a reason. Confused and uncomfortable, the young man asked what was going on and why he'd been summoned. Ariel simply explained they were betting on whether the new kid could block a surprise attack from Bella. Thanks to that, she'd made a pretty penny today. As a thank you, she tossed a portion of her winnings to her new student. He quickly caught the coin and saw a piece of gold gleaming in his hand. A single gold coin was practically a small fortune. Despite admitting they'd lost the bet, the other professors also pointed out a clear detail they had missed during the entrance exam. From the exchange just now, they became certain that the young man had intentionally avoided using his dominant hand to defend himself. It was as if he was trying to protect an immobile arm. The most logical explanation for that anomaly would be an injury, but rather than a physical, muscle injury that any professor could see through, this kid was suffering from a deeper kind of wound. A simple injury wouldn't cause someone to be so tense during such an unfamiliar, hostile ambush. Gray was surprised that the professors had deduced so many details so accurately just by watching him draw his sword to defend himself. Well, they were educators at the most prestigious institution, after all. They were academy staff, after all, and though they realized it later than Ariel, they still managed to deduce the bigger picture. With that said, Ariel shooed her colleagues away after taking their money. They had missed out on a rare gem, and she wasn't about to give Gray up. The other professors were willing to admit the kid had potential, but if that injury didn't heal and continued to worsen, Gray would forever be nothing more than a substandard academy. Admit. He didn't like the threatening tone in that professor's voice one bit. Once the skeptical professors left the office, only Ariel and her students remained inside. Now that the pests were gone, it was time to get to the real purpose of this summons. She had called him in today to discuss the topic of magic. After offering him a fragrant cup of tea, Professor Ariel recapped what she'd heard about the incident in Professor Carlos's class. She had learned from the man himself that the persistent fool had stormed into her office, demanding to transfer the new kid to the magic department. Obviously, she had refused such a ridiculous request. In her sharp eyes, Gray would become a far more terrifying monster, with a sword than with magic. As she removed her monocle to better explain her point, Gray was stunned. Professor Ariel saw absolutely no sign of a genius in magic compression. He didn't even show signs of having practiced magic on a deeper level. Gray felt a little uneasy after being scanned and read like an open book by that strange eye. Lying would be completely useless in this situation. Gray admitted that everything she had deduced was correct. Curious, she gently asked if he would be willing to share the trick he used to create that black hole ether bullet. She promised to keep it a complete secret and offered a reward in exchange for the valuable information. She really wanted to know about this promising concept, for Bella's sake. While sipping his tea, Gray almost let it slip and call the young Bella by her future title. Professor Ariel called the young girl a pure genius when it came to magic theory, but lacked the ability to apply what she could theorize. For some unknown reason, the girl was incapable of using ether compression, let alone the legendary supercompression. Based on some fragmented information from the future, he knew that Bella Albright was a late bloomer. Her lack of practical talent must have been why Ariel arranged this meeting after hearing about the ether bullet that nearly killed Leon. If there was a way to use super compressed ether without the inefficient act of internal compression, it would be a game changer. Professor Ariel was desperate for a solution. She didn't want to see one of her girls sent to Professor Bradley. Everyone in the future knew that was a cursed name. It was impossible not to know of the notorious A-class bastard. He had conducted countless independent experiments on human bodies for the sake of advancing his field, killing many in the process. On top of that, he also caused horrific magical disasters that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. Professor Bradley was the worst magical criminal in history. In this era, the maniacal, mass-murdering magical terrorist had not yet been caught. If Bella couldn't produce super-compressed ether by the end of the year, she would be sent to that mad professor to undergo a high-risk surgery. Anyone in their right mind could see this was a bad idea. Professor Ariel completely agreed. Although the surgery was disguised under the pretext of enhancing magical abilities, it was just a blatant human experiment with no guarantees. This wasn't public knowledge yet, but she had heard rumors about the madman's inhumane crimes. Some victims had died, while others were broken beyond hope. Bella interjected that although it was dangerous and scary, she would be expelled. At the end of the year, she couldn't produce any results. Honestly, Professor Ariel would rather her girl give up on magic and the academy forever than let that pervert touch Bella's body. Gray silently considered his options. He possessed magical theories that didn't exist yet. If he shared something too groundbreaking, the flow of history would be completely thrown off course. He looked at the young Bella, who was clenching her fists in frustration and fear. Gray recalled his final moments facing the purger. That frustration, fear, and despair were all too familiar. He was just a meat shield trained to fall after a single blow, a helpless spectator while the heroes, the ones who were supposed to save the world, were cut to pieces like fresh meat. Knowing the future that awaited if he didn't act, why wouldn't he want to change the flow of history? That hell on earth people called the future was better off being changed. By the time he finished his tea, he had agreed to try his best to teach Bella. The girl would be using super compressed ether in no time. After the meeting, the three of them headed to the arena as the sun began to set. Gray pulled out a blackboard and did his best to articulate what he had learned from the lectures at the training camp. After squeezing out everything he could remember, he asked the two of them to keep this privileged information under wraps and for their own use. Information leaks wouldn't be a problem because the professor had already prepared a magic contract. Those who break the contract will die. After a brief explanation, Gray asked them what they thought of the theory. Just knowing about the concept of OD was enough to stun Professor Ariel. But the magical knowledge he revealed was even more absurd. Bella praised his explanation for being concise yet well organized. She felt like she was listening to a lecture on magic from hundreds of years in the future. Just by Bella hearing and absorbing that information, the history of magic in this room had advanced by 100 years. She kept gushing about how magic had advanced by a whole century, but Gray himself had learned all these basic concepts from the adult mage just 10 years from now. It was a testament to her genius. There was so much information that even Professor Ariel couldn't properly assess and grasp, so she deferred to her little magic prodigy. According to Bella's preliminary assessment, there was a high probability that the theory was sound. There were no concepts that contradicted the current magical theory the world operated on, but the fastest way to know for sure was to test it. That's why they had taken over the arena in the first place. If this theory was sound, then the spell Bella came up with on the spot should work. Holding the staff with both hands, she put her faith in Gray's teachings and channeled her full power. That didn't sound like a good thing. If he remembered correctly, Bella Albright's power was rumored to be capable of incinerating an entire city in an instant. She was practically a weapon of mass destruction. Moreover, she was notorious for not being able to properly control her immense mana pool. Today was definitely the day he would witness that legendary display of overwhelming power. Even Bella was shocked by what she had just created. A massive, scorching flame shot out from the middle of the arena and soared into the clouds. Gray had tried to warn her about this reckless idea, but it was too late. A pillar of fire stood tall with the young mage at its epicenter, supporting a magnificent magic circle. This overwhelming power was at the pinnacle of magic in his previous life. If Bella hadn't controlled the spell just a moment sooner, he would have been swallowed by the flames. That delicate control over the element had literally saved his life. Unaware of others' fear, Bella was beaming with joy. She had finally done it. She had bridged the gap between her theoretical and practical talents. Pushing herself further, she continued to tame the pillar of fire, molding it into the shape of a roaring fire dragon. For the first time in her life, she found magic to be fun. She got carried away by her emotions and quickly exhausted herself. The flame died down, and she felt the side effects of the test immediately as her ether reserves depleted. Her legs gave out, and she lost consciousness. The staff clattered to the floor, and so did her body. Worried, Gray rushed over to the girl, who was unconscious while the professor told him to calm down. This fainting spell was a classic case of ether depletion. All Bella needed was a bit of rest, and she'd be back to 100% in no time. Hearing that eased Gray's worries. However, even Ariel was astounded by the display of incredible magical talent the young girl had shown. She might be the only person who could produce magic on that scale after just learning a new concept. While completely out of it, the dozing mage mumbled that it wasn't her who was amazing, but the theory. Gray had given her the tools to easily create her own super compressed ether. Well, it was a tool she was supposed to develop in the future. Ariel breathed a sigh of relief. Bella no longer needed that magic criminal's shady surgery. She would gladly curse Bradley herself. The professor was happy to see the young mage avoid a path of ruin. She was especially glad that she hadn't lost control of her magic through some kind of officially sanctioned experiment. Even though Bradley's special surgeries were proven to increase one's magic output, they came at the cost of control. The exact mechanism was still a mystery, but it was highly likely that madmen had found a way to forcibly break a person's limits. It made sense now. That's why the mage from the previous world was rumored to be an out-of-control weapon of mass destruction. Anyway, the tremendous progress made today would have been impossible without Gray's help. The terms of their contract had been fulfilled. Now it was the professor's turn to uphold her end of the bargain, written on the magic paper. First, she had promised to do something about his arm. There was a spell in her arsenal that could help. She reached out her hand. She summoned countless ethereal butterflies made of pure ether. They fluttered around the arena as she gently touched her student's arm. Upon contact, the ether in the area swirled and stirred, gathering at the point of connection for a few seconds. Gray openly accepted the healing touch. Then, he tried clenching his injured hand and felt a distinct difference in comfort compared to before. He could finally move his dominant hand again. It was a drastic improvement. With his spirits lifted, he wholeheartedly thanked the professor for solving one of his biggest problems. Not even a magic healing potion could fix his mysterious injury, yet her gentle touch had done the trick. She boasted that her nerve restoration magic shouldn't be mentioned in the same breath as common magic healing potions. Before they got too carried away, she wanted to make sure he was truly 100% recovered. To test that, Gray had to try swinging his sword. For the first time in a long while, he touched the hilt of his sword with his dominant hand. He drew his sword quickly and made a casual slash. Immediately, he noticed something alarming despite the supposedly fully recovered arm. To confirm, he lowered his stance and went through his swordsmanship forms to see how it felt. To his dismay, his right arm no longer felt as fluid in its movements as before. Professor Ariel had anticipated this would happen. She may have repaired the nerves to a perfect state, but her magic couldn't heal the wounds on the young man's soul. Hearing her mention the soul left, Gray confused. While today's magical knowledge hadn't proven the existence of the human soul, Ariel was a firm believer that it existed. After all, she could see it with this special eye of hers. Hidden beneath that sparkling monocle was an all-seeing eye that could perceive everything. Right now, she could see Gray's soul was healing itself. Over time, he reasoned that as long as he didn't overexert himself, he would recover naturally. He naively asked if practicing swordsmanship counted as overexertion. The professor answered no, he could train normally. Instead, she asked him what kind of swordsmanship he practiced could cause such heavy damage to one's soul. But then, swordsmanship that used the soul as fuel wasn't a new idea. In fact, she knew someone with this same ability. Amy White was another student of the Special Mystic Eyes course. She figured there must be some connection between these two students of hers. Gray was shocked and confused as to why Professor Ariel would think that. He hadn't even met the future sword saint in this timeline yet. Ariel assumed Gray knew Amy based on the way he swung his sword. It gave the impression that he had learned it from that sword geek. On second thought, the professor noticed a few minor differences. It felt like the person he learned swordsmanship from was a much more polished version of young Amy. She estimated that in a few years, Amy would be as skilled as whoever Gray's master was. Her deductive abilities were terrifying. Her eye could see the smallest details, and she could interpret them expertly. Gray claimed that he learned his swordsmanship at the dojo in his hometown, which technically wasn't a lie. Now, he needed to change the subject, lest he risk revealing his secret, returning to the topic of the damaged soul and swordsmanship. Normal techniques couldn't possibly connect these two intangible concepts in the first place. She was well aware that Gray had some kind of secret move that could defeat an ogre general, an ogre army, and everything around them with just a single slash. She had done her research, thanks to Gray's absurd achievements. The bet she proposed to the boy Leon at the entrance ceremony was an easy win, and Ariel was shown some of the remains left at the scene, and she found them truly magnificent. Even the most sophisticated cutting magic couldn't achieve that level of precision and damage. The mysterious power within Gray, whatever it was, had inflicted a wound upon his soul. She could see it with her own eyes. Ariel could see right through his soul and peek at the power leaking through a chained door. Hearing her say this made him believe her. The chained door was the image he constantly envisioned in his mind. This wasn't something a person could just guess. This woman was the real deal. That said, Ariel had seen a power similar to Gray's before. While it wasn't a one-for-one copy, they had a very similar feel to them. Curious, he asked if there was anyone else with a similar mysterious power, and she knew one person who fit that description. But she wasn't 100% sure if they were even human. Professor Ariel called it the Purifier, the very same purifier that had ushered in the apocalypse. Based on his reaction, she could tell the boy had heard of it one way or another. Gray's mind reeled. Why was the Purifier being mentioned so early in this timeline? The alluring professor hadn't expected the young man to be familiar with such an esoteric creature. But then again, he knew some futuristic magic theories, so it shouldn't have been that surprising. Gray felt a little awkward getting credit for the revolutionary theory when he was simply repeating what he had learned from the true genius. Curious, Ariel pressed him on how much he knew about the so-called Purifier. Truth be told, he didn't know much, but he was certain that the Purifier was an extremely dangerous threat to humanity. The creature had to be stopped before it could gather more power, something that needed to be eliminated at all costs. Ariel found his stance a little too extreme. She agreed that the Purifier posed some danger, though. Bailey and Bradley seemed intent on continuing his experiments on the subject. It sounded as if the future apocalyptic cataclysm had something to do with the infamous magical terrorist. As far as Ariel knew, the Purifier was the very being that Bailey and Bradley was trying to summon. This was news to Gray. No one had ever told him about the origin of humanity's enemy. Come to think of it, the Academy in the previous timeline had served as a focal point in history. The higher-ups acted as if they knew exactly where the Purifier would appear. There was a high probability that the World Union Academy itself had a hand in summoning the Purifier from the very beginning. The professor and the tight-lipped freshman agreed that this extremely reckless experiment had to be stopped before it got out of hand. Unfortunately, the person running the research was also a tenured professor, so Ariel had no authority to stop him or his experiments. She had tried to push the higher-ups to act, but they simply wouldn't listen. Unfortunately, she wasn't at liberty to disclose any further information to a mere student. The bottom line was that unless an order came from the higher-ups, no one could force Bailey and Bradley to stop his madness. Gray had hoped to at least get the names of the Academy's higher-ups, but that was impossible at the moment. It seemed the Academy's leadership structure was more complicated than he'd thought. But if he could prove Professor Bradley was a dangerous criminal, maybe they would have enough evidence to change things. In the previous timeline, Balian's illegal experiments had claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people, and Gray knew where these atrocities would take place. It wouldn't hurt to share this information with Professor Ariel. That way, they could catch the madman red-handed. But she flatly shot down the idea. Infiltrating an Academy professor's research facility without permission was considered a heinous crime in itself. They might have to fabricate concrete evidence some other way, without putting themselves at risk of ending up in prison. But if Gray could come up with some hard evidence right now, that could change everything. Otherwise, they had no choice but to put the idea on the back burner. It sounded like Ariel was aware of the potential dangers, but her hands were tied by bureaucracy and academic politics. It was frustrating but understandable. More importantly, she wanted to delve deeper into the subject of Gray's mysterious power. She teased that there might be a way for him to learn how to control that deadly weapon. There was a professor at the Academy who specialized in handling mysterious forces. Gray's case was the perfect puzzle for him to unravel. His name was Professor Heathcote Longfellow. Gray had heard the name before. Heathcote Longfellow was the man who trained the Sword Saint. He was a legendary figure, and Ariel knew the idea would pique the young man's interest. She promised to arrange a private training session with the Stoic professor for tomorrow. Gray gratefully accepted Ariel's help. This was the very reason he had come to the Academy. To master this power, after all, he hadn't expected to find such a solid lead this quickly. Things were finally looking up. The very next day, Gray found himself standing before the stern professor. His first private lesson with Heathcote Longfellow was underway. Ariel certainly worked fast. Gray had expected a grueling training session or extensive theoretical lessons, but Professor Longfellow had dragged him into the forest instead, and now they were running in circles. They were still within the academy's grounds, but they were in the middle of a dense forest. While he was trying to understand the purpose of this aimless running, Professor Longfellow scolded him for letting his mind wander. Instead of getting lost in thought, he should pick up the pace. Instead, they were to run and push their bodies to the absolute limit. Longfellow believed that the power of the soul only truly awakens when every last drop of physical stamina has been burned away. Gray was forbidden from touching his sword. Until every last ounce of his stamina was depleted, the young man still couldn't see the full picture. But he had full faith in Heathcote's methods. However, while he was running around in circles, Balian was conducting his inhumane experiments to summon the apocalyptic judge. It was hard to get that nagging thought out of his head. Gray was carrying the burden of his future sight, and it was slowing him down. However, he stuck with the training regimen for a full week. On the 7th day, he was summoned to report back to Professor Ariel. Gray felt a bit embarrassed since all he had done was run relentlessly, and only a little bit of sword practice at the end of each session. He had to admit he did feel a slight improvement in his power. Ariel couldn't suppress an amused chuckle. She was well aware of Heathcote's eccentric methods. As the debriefing concluded, a polite messenger entered the office. He presented a sealed letter addressed to Professor Ariel. She immediately opened the letter, and her expression twisted as she read its contents. By the time she finished reading, she was frozen in her seat with distress. Gray asked what was wrong. She silently handed him the letter to see for himself. It was better that way. It was a letter written by Balian Bradley. The madman had received the report on Bella Albright's supercompressed ether breakthrough. He insisted that despite the similarities, the young mage hadn't actually reached the reported level. Therefore, he refused to recognize her new ability, and as such, the surgery contract was still in effect, and the surgery would proceed as scheduled. It was an absurd letter written by a master of provocation. It was insane. Ariel was livid. It seemed Balian Bradley was determined to get a perfect guinea pig in the form of Bella. He was trying to force her into a completely unnecessary and dangerous surgery. Unfortunately, the madman held all the cards. The magical contract Bella had signed was unbreakable. Unless Bradley himself nullified it, Bella was forced to choose between being expelled and handing her body over to a lunatic. Gray refused to accept that bullshit, and Ariel was on the same page. This letter spurred her into action, all red tape be damned, and she needed Gray's help. She wanted to know the location of Bradley's secret laboratory. It would be risky, but she had to expose that bastard as a criminal to render that outrageous contract null and void. She had finally decided to get her hands dirty. This was exactly what Gray needed, he asked gleefully. Why did she change her mind when exposing a colleague without solid evidence in hand? Was too great a risk? Well, they were no longer operating within the bounds of the law. She was putting her faith in Gray to protect another one of her precious students. From the very beginning, her foresight told her this would happen, that Gray had been telling the truth all along. It took some time and a ridiculously blatant letter to admit it, but Ariel finally came to her senses. It was time for Gray to lead the way, illuminated by his knowledge of the future. Together, they would bring that psycho's crimes against humanity to light. The Black Swordsman returns. According to what he knew, that disgusting laboratory was hidden in the mountains near the village of Toriel. Professor Ariel vaguely recalled news that one of the other faculty members had been granted a permit to build a laboratory there. This meant that those illegal and inhumane experiments had been approved by the Academy. There was no better place to conduct illegal research than the Toriel mountain range. The reality was that no one would notice if he was there long term. On top of that, the Academy's professors respected the unwritten rule that forbade interfering with each other's projects. But as long as they could gather evidence proving that crimes against humanity were being committed, they wouldn't be charged with trespassing. While they were discussing their plan of attack, Bella knocked on the door and Ariel let her in. She had just received a letter containing horrifying news. Her emotions were in turmoil, filled with a sense of defeat. Professor Ariel snatched the letter from her hand, reassuring Bella that this mess would be handled one way or another. It sounded like Ariel was planning to take on Varian Bradley all by herself, and Bella wasn't about to stand by and let that happen. With a confident smile, she insisted she could handle that bastard herself any time. The young girl looked worriedly at Gray, pleading with her eyes for him to intervene, so he stepped up and pledged to accompany the professor. Regaining her resolve, Bella also volunteered to go. She didn't want to rely on others to solve her problems. Ariel thought she could act alone. She warned them that Varian was a seasoned professor, and not only that, he was also a madman with no regard for human life. If he caught an inexperienced student trying to sabotage his plans, there was no telling what he might do. As the adult in this conversation, she couldn't let these kids put themselves in danger. But Gray saw this as all the more reason why going alone was even more dangerous. He asserted that he could tap into the power he used to take down a demon, a giant if necessary. He wouldn't be a burden. Besides, if something bad were to happen to Ariel, the Divine Eye program would surely be dissolved, which meant Gray and his friends would be expelled. He'd rather have a say in his own future, a choice in deciding their own fate. Seeing the determination in their eyes, Ariel couldn't possibly refuse. They spoke as if they would go even if she forbade it. In that case, she would agree to make this a team mission on one condition. No matter what happened, they had to prioritize their own safety above all else. Gray and Bella quickly accepted the condition. After taking some precautions, the three of them ventured into the haunted hills of the Torowell mountain range. Hidden deep within, Varian Bradley's massive private laboratory came into view. It was hard to imagine what horrors were taking place inside those towering walls. Once again, the main objective of this mission was to gather evidence of criminal activity. Nothing more, nothing less. With a look of clear anger, Gray confirmed they were in the right place. Bella, on the other hand, felt a sense of dread. She wasn't sure if they could really pull this off without any trouble. Professor Ariel had done her research. Varian Bradley should be at the Magic Society conference right now. The lab was supposed to be Varian-free, but there was still a high probability that the main gate was riddled with all sorts of traps. To be safe, they should break through the side wall and create their own entrance. Breaking into an Academy-sanctioned lab was already a crime anyway. It made no difference what method they used. One last time, Ariel gave Bella a chance to turn back if she'd changed her mind. Gripping her staff tightly, she cast aside any doubt. She asked if the professor was really willing to go through all this trouble for someone like her. Gray interjected and replied that this operation wasn't just for her sake. Stopping Varian Bradley's nefarious plans was for the good of the entire world. If they didn't do something now, countless people would die and the whole world would suffer. Professor Ariel found his reasoning a bit exaggerated, but she agreed that the perverted beast had to be stopped, so Bella should just calm down and stop overthinking it. She wasn't the only one who needed saving. After setting the foreplay aside, Ariel led the way, towing Bella along, while Gray ran at full speed beside them. When they reached the towering laboratory's side wall, she calmly activated a fire spell. Multiple streaks of fire erupted, tearing through the concrete with no resistance. The ensuing explosion lit up the entire mountain with a blinding flash of light. You had to hand it to the professor, but she knew how to make a grand entrance. Gray was the first to peer through the instant entryway. What he saw inside sent shivers down his spine. Before him was a long, dark hallway with countless cells, lining both sides. Inside those cells were emaciated people, shackled and immobilized by brutal torture. Some looked as if they were already dead. Some were missing limbs and bleeding from open, infected wounds. They knew they would find something, but they didn't expect it to be this soon. They didn't even have to try to look for incriminating evidence. The group walked through the long corridor, every single barred cell filled with Varian Bradley's victims. So far, Ariel had noted traces of 14 forbidden spells used on the prisoners. That fact alone was enough to convict Varian of serious crimes, not to mention the long list of obvious human rights violations that had been committed in this place. Eventually, they reached a huge room in the middle of the lab. The floor was caked with old and new blood. In the center, an ominous magic circle could be seen. It looked like some kind of altar. The original plan was to get inside, grab some concrete evidence, and then retreat, but the kind-hearted young mage felt compelled to rescue the people trapped in this living hell. Gray felt a disturbing premonition. They shouldn't stay in this place for long. A rescue mission would take too much time, and Varian could be back before they could figure out their next move. A ghostly figure emerged from the shadows. He leisurely strolled toward the group as if he were taking a walk in his own private garden. Professor Ariel immediately recognized the man approaching them. It was the man, the myth, the legend, the insufferably ugly mad scientist, Varian Bradley, the dude who thinks he's got charisma. Gray immediately drew his sword, ready to counter whatever evil the old man was about to unleash. Varian Bradley boasted that he had arranged for a body double to attend the conference in his place. After all, he was on the verge of a major breakthrough in his experiments. The guy bragged that he had acquired some extremely fresh materials for an important ceremony. He preferred to use his human guinea pigs while they were still fresh and breathing. Seeing Professor Ariel and her precious students on his doorstep, he decided to pivot and change his plans. Ariel was worried for her students. Bella was paralyzed by a terror that reached her very core, and Gray was ready to throw down at any moment. Tonight's experiment would yield much better results if the materials used had more magical potential than the average person. Varian didn't know how they discovered his little slice of hell on Earth, but he was certain these three were operating in secret. That meant they never told anyone where they were going. If they all suddenly disappeared, no one would know where to look. No matter what kind of twisted thing Varian had in store for them, it wouldn't lead to any suspicion. Forget crimes against humanity. Give this guy the electric chair for that creepy smile alone. Listening to his villainous monologue, it was obvious that Professor Varian was itching to turn them into guinea pigs to push the very limits of magic at a great cost. Since they had seen all his evil deeds, he couldn't possibly let them live. He could also make the best use of their magical potential. In the middle of his grand monologue, Varian saw a giant fireball heading straight for his head. The spell exploded with a fiery blast that lit up the dusty room. Surprisingly, the attack didn't come from Professor Ariel. It came from the future great sage herself, Bella Albright. Looking at the girl's determined expression, it seemed her initial fear had vanished. Unfortunately, a sneak attack of this caliber wouldn't cut it. Varian had protected himself with a barrier in the nick of time. Still, he praised the girl's excellent potential and decisiveness. He figured discovering such an exceptional talent was thanks to Ariel's mystic eyes. He had never really paid attention to the special admission classes before. Maybe he should start taking a closer look at the other rookies from that controversial batch. However, a measly academy student trying to assassinate a professor would never succeed. The gap was just too wide. Casting aside all fear, Bella accepted that it was better to get her hands dirty than to be killed. She had almost missed her chance. Despite being worried about her student, Ariel ordered a retreat. They had the evidence now, and the academy would be able to handle the rest. Professor Varian wasn't about to let them just walk away. Before they could even move, a blazing stream of dark energy shot out from the deranged professor's staff. In retaliation, his main target was Bella, who looked like a deer in the headlights. Ariel had to move quickly to take the brunt of the attack with her light barrier. With intense concentration, she reinforced the barrier as the dark energy continued its assault. Varian arrogantly explained that defensive magic was useless against this gluttonous flame, one of the prized results from his extensive research. This spell created a flame so greedy that it burned and devoured defensive magic, turning it into fuel. In theory, it was a perfect, unblockable spell. Its only drawback was that it required the use of certain rare biological materials to cast. Just as Varian explained, Ariel's barrier was quickly torn apart and consumed, making the gluttonous flame even bigger and wilder. She tried to salvage the situation by using her mystic eyes, and tapping into that mysterious power bought her enough time to erect another barrier. When the first layer finally gave way, the second one took the full force of the empowered forbidden spell. As expected, Ariel's second barrier was also corroded and absorbed by the flame within seconds. Fearing the worst, she threw a magic memory pouch to Bella and Gray. She figured that if Heathcote saw the pouch, that man would know what to do. Instead of taking the evidence and running, Bella put up a barrier of her own. Ariel started to panic. She had accepted that this could be the end for her, but it didn't have to be for her students. Even so, Bella didn't like the idea of abandoning her professor in the middle of a fight when she still had some fight left in her. Ariel reiterated the promise they made before this mission. They all agreed that if something went wrong, survival had to be the priority. Varian's magic was clearly unnatural. All Ariel could do was buy time with her rapidly weakening defensive spells while arguing with her student. That defensive spell finally shattered. She felt the backlash as her spell was broken, and Bella quickly took over. Her faint barrier impressively held against the power of the gluttonous flame. Bella had analyzed Varian's attack and realized that it wasn't that strong on its own. It just needed a slightly different kind of defensive magic to counter it. Seeing his flame being stopped, Varian was practically frozen. The counter-magic theory for this spell was only known by a handful of people, so how could a measly student have figured it out? Bella casually replied that recently, a certain someone had taught her some new theories, thanks to which all magic became much easier to decipher. From the brink of being frozen, Varian went completely ballistic. He thought that someone in his inner circle had betrayed him, and demanded to know the traitor's name. Teasing him with the most innocent look, she kept her teacher's identity a secret. The man who opened up the world of magic to her was just a Kate, student from the swordsmanship course. He had patiently conveyed some crazy ideas about magic theory, and with Bella's natural talent, piecing all the information together came naturally. Varian was the victim of a successful troll. Look at this dude's veins, fellas, they're about to pop. Have you ever been trolled so hard that you had to pull out a suspicious blood-soaked crystal to further empower your finishing move? Crushing the blood crystal in his hand, the human souls trapped inside rushed out to provide power. The gluttonous flame now looked more like a sentient beast than an inanimate spell. Varian might be committing crimes against magic and humanity, but his magic looked sick as hell. Even so, Bella estimated that her barrier could hold for a little while longer. Theoretically, she could prolong this stalemate indefinitely, but her mana reserves wouldn't last long. At best, she could probably only hold on for another minute. Since she was tied up with defense, Ariel would have to handle the offense. Using her mystic eyes, the red-haired professor focused intently, seeing the flow of magic clearly. She saw a spot where the flame was particularly thin. If she could project her mana outside the barrier, Ariel might be able to break through. She created charged mana threads to freely pass through Bella's steel-like barrier. From her position to Varian's, Ariel had a clear line for a critical strike. Unfortunately, her winding mana threads were too weak to penetrate the gluttonous flame. They slowly weakened until they were completely extinguished. Varian scoffed at that pathetic counter-attack attempt. As far as Gray remembered, Professor Ariel's attack magic was among the weakest of the staff. Her specialty lay in a different field, related to the properties of flames. Her already weak attack power must have also been devoured. They had to find a way to end this quickly. Bella was starting to feel exhausted. Her stance was faltering and her hands were shaking. The barrier could collapse at any moment. This was exactly why Ariel had tried to get her students to run to safety earlier. With all other options exhausted, it was time for the main character, Gray, to step up. Bella didn't know how he could possibly deal any damage when there was a whole storm of powerful magic standing between his sword and Varian. Gray basically said, "Nah, I'd win." Professor Ariel could read his plan and warned Gray not to use his mysterious power again. Using it too soon could make his recovering arm unhealable or even kill him. However, one person dying is better than all three, right? Besides, they were worrying for nothing. The MC quickly broke through the gluttonous flame, flashing a deadly red light for Varian to see on the other side. The last thing the mad professor saw was Gray's impossibly perfect slash mixed with the spray of his own blood. His brain was still trying to process what the hell had just happened, while his head was already cleanly separated from his body. Just like that, Professor Varian Bradley was duly executed for his numerous crimes. His executioner was the very man who would change the course of history.